Well, I found my new confidence bait for Carolina rigging. I can't wait to show it to you. But first I want to talk about what I was looking for. Number one is how visible the lure is under the water. And I'm not talking about color. What I'm talking about, does it stay above that bottom composition? Whether that's a problem because of slipping down into rocks or muck, leaves, vegetation, whatever it may be. And number two is the ability to stay up in the water column longer, whether that's when it's floating down on the initial cast or when it pops free from some sort of snag. And I also want to go over, I'm not talking about brands when I'm talking about the best lure for a Carolina rig. I'm talking about body styles. In fact, I tested 21 different body styles and it took a long time. And the other factor that was real important is the lure material, what the lure was made of. Knowledge is power, and this way you can make informed decisions when you go to find lures for your Carolina rig, because so often what we think is going on is definitely not what is actually happening under the water. I wanted to keep things consistent, so my leader was about 4 foot in length, and I used a 10-pound test copolymer, and then I also had an offset light wire hook. This is my favorite Carolina rig hook. Now, the first thing that I did is I wanted to test the sink or the glide of a bunch of different body styles. And not only is this important on that initial cast, because on that first part of the cast, when that big weight drops through the bottom, that often is going to get the attention of fish in the area. And then behind that weight, we've got this lure just gradually coming down to the bottom. So through these 21 different body styles of lures, naturally, as we would think, ones that have a wider profile to them are going to glide down through the water column better. Something like a stick bait really comes down through the water quickly. And the other reason that this sink or glide is really important, because every time that weight gets hung up on something, whether it's a branch or a rock or some vegetation, whatever it could be, when we as anglers pop that weight free and it shoots off of the bottom, it pulls the lure up off the bottom as well, and then that gliding action back down to the bottom is so often when we get those bites. That's why this was so important to watch. Now, as far as the actual crawling on the bottom, this is where it gets kind of interesting, and I've talked about many times on this channel, efficiency is so important, and in this particular situation, being seen or visible is the efficiency I'm talking about. But that lure is not as visible as often as we think it is, and when that weight is scooting along, getting the attention of the fish, we want to follow it up with something that they easily see right away. So that's where lures that have wider appendages, a flatter body, even something as simple as a twin-tail grub was so much easier to be seen than something like a stick bait on a Carolina rig. And even when we're talking about creature style baits, when you've got a slender style creature bait, this gets hidden much easier than the creature bait that has a wider overall profile. So those are all things that are going to help your lure stay up on top of whatever it is on the bottom of your lake bed and be seen easier and be seen from a distance and more often by those fish. And here's where things get really interesting. All of the plastisol lures would eventually sink all the way down to the bottom. But when I switched over to start testing lures made out of Elastec, and there's several different ones and different manufacturers on the marketplace that have got these Elastec lures, this is where the visibility completely changes. The first one I did was just a 7-inch finesse worm, and every time I would stop the weight or stop dragging or moving that Carolina rig, that worm would just stand right up vertical. A very different presentation than we often think about when it comes to a Carolina rig. Then I tested 2 different soft jerk baits, and it's super important to note here. One was salt added or salt to the surface, and then the other Elastec lure was salt impregnated, heavily salt impregnated to give it that slower sink. And we look at the jerk bait here first that is just salt added, so it's basically straight Elastec. This soft jerk bait just stays in the water column and sits up, you know, kind of strange, kind of weird looking, and doesn't get down to the bottom really at all. Even when it gets a little bit of vegetation on it, it still suspends up there in the water column. Probably not the presentation we're looking for. But when we go to the salt impregnated, heavily salt impregnated Elastec, now not only is the glide really impressive on this particular lure, both in a 5-inch and a 3.5-inch version, but it likes to stay just off of the lake bed throughout almost the entire presentation. It's just up a few inches off of the bottom. When we go ahead and pop that weight, it'll shoot up higher and then settle back down. And if we just keep scooting it along and keep moving along, it is up into the water column better than any other lure that is out there. And the crazy thing is, the bass in the area noticed it right away. Now, when I'm doing this testing, I'm banging around on the dock, causing all kinds of commotion. Most fish kind of, you know, they scatter off, they leave me alone. But when I was testing these two salt-impregnated Elastec lures, the bass in the area, even though they weren't huge, could not leave them alone. As a matter of fact, this one startled me so bad, I completely lost control of the camera. It's hard to use the rod and then run the camera at the same time, but just drilled that Elastec lure. And then when I switched to the smaller one, this bass hit it on the very first cast that I made, and you can see it running around. So my confidence level right now for a lure on a Carolina rig is this 5-inch salt impregnated Elastec jerkbait. This is just does a tremendous job. And if it wasn't for testing all these different body styles and materials, I'm not sure if that's the one that I would have picked out. And hey, if you want to watch a video that talks about some ideas about monofilament or some things about monofilament line that just aren't true, even though we've been told this over and over, go ahead and check this one out right here. And make sure that you go out and encourage someone today. You never know how you might just change their life. For the Bass Fishing Life, I'm your host, Steve Rogers.